Gary Gunderson had survived Black Friday at a super mega mart in Houston, so when the four-armed Crixian enforcer pointed a plasma disruptor at his face, he merely sighed and checked his watch. "I'm sorry, but our office hours are 9 to 5, standard galactic time," Gary said, adjusting his tie. "If you'd like to file a complaint about our operations, I can schedule you for Tuesday at 2. The Crixian's mandibles clicked in confusion. "You misunderstand, human. You will come with us now." Gary pulled out his tablet and began tapping. "I understand you're frustrated, but unfortunately we have strict protocols about unannounced visits. Do you have an appointment confirmation number?" 3 months ago, Gary had been managing customer service complaints about defective toasters. Now he was the operations director for the Velcara Syndicate's Earth-based money laundering operation, a job he'd accepted only after the syndicate's previous human had mysteriously disappeared, and they'd threatened to vaporize his entire apartment building. The syndicate had assumed that because Gary could navigate Byzantine corporate return policies, he'd be perfect for managing their complex financial schemes. They weren't entirely wrong. Gary followed the Crixian enforcers through the neon-soaked streets of New Houston's Alien Quarter, mentally composing an incident report. The syndicate operated out of a converted warehouse that officially processed interstellar artisan goods, but actually funneled protection money, illegal weapon sales, and contraband pharmaceutical proceeds through a network of shell companies Gary had inherited from his predecessor. Inside the warehouse, crime lord Velcara herself waited, her serpentine body coiled around a hovering throne. Her scales shimmered purple and gold, and her eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd personally eliminated 17 rivals to claim her position. Next to her stood Brakther, her chief enforcer, a towering ergolite whose species was known for solving problems by crushing them. Velcara's forked tongue tasted the air. "Gary Gunderson, you are late." "Actually," Gary said, consulting his tablet, "according to the memo I sent last week, our weekly review meeting was moved to Thursday due to the Galactic Banking Oversight Committee's surprise inspection." "There is no inspection," Velcara hissed. "Not yet," Gary agreed, "but I filed a formal request with them about clarifying the tax codes on imports from the Nebulan sector. I expect they'll want to review our documentation sometime next month." Brakther's crest flared red. "You contacted the regulatory authorities?" "Of course. How else would we ensure compliance?" Gary pulled up a spreadsheet. "Speaking of which, I need everyone's updated background checks for the employee files. Galactic law requires it for anyone handling financial instruments." Velcara's eyes narrowed to slits. "We are a criminal organization, human." "I understand that," Gary said patiently, using the same tone he'd once used to explain return policies to people who'd clearly destroyed their own products. "But even criminal organizations have to follow certain regulations if they want to avoid unwanted attention. For instance, did you know you're required to file a D12 form for any transaction over 50,000 credits that crosses sector boundaries?" "No one files D12 forms," Brakther growled. Gary made a note on his tablet. "Well, that explains why the Krelax Syndicate got raided last month. I sent you all an email about it." The room fell silent. The Krelax Syndicate had been the Velcara organization's primary competitor, until galactic authority ships had systematically dismantled their entire operation. "The Krelax were raided because they murdered a council member's nephew," Velcara said slowly. "That's what the news reported," Gary agreed. "But the actual legal basis for the raid was financial irregularities. Specifically, failure to properly document cross-sector transactions. I attached the court documents to my email. Did you not read them?" Velcara's scales rippled with irritation, but she remained silent. In truth, none of them had understood the human's incomprehensible email system with its endless attachments and CC lines. Gary continued, "Which brings me to today's agenda. I've identified several areas where we're potentially non-compliant with the galactic commerce regulations, and I'd like to propose some organizational restructuring to address these gaps." For the next hour, Gary walked them through a presentation that would have put any corporate consultant to shame. He divided their illegal operations into color-coded categories, created a compliance matrix, and developed what he called an actionable roadmap for sustainable growth in a dynamic regulatory environment. Brakther looked ready to commit violence. Velcara simply stared at the human, as if trying to determine whether he was brilliantly subversive or catastrophically stupid. These changes, she finally said, will slow our operations. In the short term, yes, Gary admitted, but they'll also make us significantly harder to prosecute. Think of it as an investment in organizational longevity. What Gary didn't mention was that his actual plan was to make the syndicate so tangled in bureaucratic red tape that they'd eventually up and release him from his forced employment. He'd been implementing this strategy for weeks, burying every operation under forms, procedures, and compliance requirements. So far, it had only made them more successful, which was becoming a problem. The meeting ended with Velkara grudgingly approving most of his proposals, primarily because she didn't fully understand them. As Gary prepared to leave, Bracther blocked his path. The Urgolite leaned down, his breath hot and smelling of sulfur. "I do not trust you, human." Gary looked up at the 8-foot-tall killer without flinching. "That's fine. According to the organizational hierarchy I established, you don't report to me anyway. You'll want to take any concerns to your direct supervisor." He checked his tablet. "That would be Velkara. I can schedule a one-on-one for you if you'd like to discuss your feelings about trust in the workplace." Bracther's fists clenched, but he stepped aside. Gary made it 3 blocks before the ambush. 5 figures emerged from the shadows, members of the Zorgath clan based on their distinctive gray exoskeletons. Their leader, a scarred veteran named Thraka, aimed a pulse rifle at Gary's chest. "You come with us, human. The Zorgath have questions about Velkara's recent expansion." Gary stopped walking and pulled out his tablet. "Do you have a warrant or writ of compelling testimony from a recognized galactic authority?" Thraka's antennae twitched. "What? A warrant? Legal documentation authorizing you to detain me?" Gary tapped through several screens. "Because according to the Treaty of Xandar, which governs criminal territorial disputes, you can't just grab people from neutral zones without proper authorization. This street falls under Port Authority jurisdiction, not clan territory." "We don't need authorization," Thraka snarled. "We have guns." "I understand you're frustrated," Gary said, his customer service instincts kicking in, "but violence is really a last resort in dispute resolution. Have you considered filing a formal complaint with the Intersyndicate Mediation Board?" "There is no such thing," one of the other Marcus muttered. "Not yet," Gary agreed, "but there could be. I actually have a proposal written up about establishing one. Would you like me to send it to you? What's your email address?" Thraka's rifle lowered slightly, confusion replacing aggression. "My what? Email, electronic mail. How do you handle interorganizational communication?" Gary's fingers flew across his tablet. "Actually, this is perfect timing. I've been meaning to reach out to the Zorgath about the territory dispute. See, Velkara's expansion into the Dock District was actually approved by the Port Authority 6 months ago. But there was an administrative error in the filing system that made it look like the permits were issued to the Krelax instead. I have the corrected documentation here." He turned his tablet around, showing a screen full of official-looking forms, stamps, and signatures that he'd spent 2 weeks creating, and then retroactively filing through a loophole in the Port Authority's digital record system. Thraka stared at the documents, his compound eyes struggling to process the bureaucratic maze. "This is irrelevant." "I understand it seems that way," Gary said sympathetically, "but actually, if you proceed with hostile action against Velkara Holdings without recognizing the legitimate territorial permits, you'll be in violation of Port Authority regulations. That could result in trade sanctions, which would impact your clan's shipping operations quite severely." He pulled up another screen. "According to my analysis, approximately 63% of your revenue comes from port-adjacent activities." "How do you know that?" one of the other Zorgath demanded. "Public records," Gary said. "Well, semi-public. I filed a Freedom of Information request. Took 3 weeks to get the data, but it was worth it for the strategic planning." Thraka's rifle lowered completely. "You are saying we cannot touch Velkara's territory because of permits?" "I'm saying that doing so would expose you to legal complications that would far outweigh any territorial gains," Gary corrected. "However, I'd be happy to schedule a meeting between Zorgath representatives and Velkara's team to discuss your concerns through proper channels. We could potentially negotiate a revenue-sharing agreement for the disputed zone. I have some time next week." The Zorgath soldiers looked at each other, a silent conversation happening through pheromone signals Gary couldn't detect. Finally, Thraka holstered his weapon. "Send me these documents," he said. "Absolutely. What's the best way to reach you?" After exchanging contact information and scheduling a meeting for the following Tuesday, the Zorgath simply left. Their planned kidnapping, abandoned in the face of Gary's relentless bureaucracy. Gary allowed himself a small smile. Maybe his plan was working after all. The smile faded when he returned to his apartment and found Velkara waiting inside, having somehow bypassed his locks. "The Zorgath contacted me," she said. "They want to negotiate." "That's good news," Gary said carefully, setting his tablet on the counter. "They have never wanted to negotiate before. They have only wanted to fight." Velkara's tongue flickered. "What did you do?" Gary shrugged. "I explained the legal complications of their proposed actions and offered an alternative dispute resolution pathway. You confused them with paperwork. I provided them with information necessary to make an informed decision about their strategic options," Gary corrected. Velkara uncoiled slightly, her massive head moving closer to Gary. "The Krelax Syndicate, the raid. That was you as well, wasn't it?" Gary kept his expression neutral, a skill he'd perfected during years of dealing with customers who'd screamed at him about coupon policies. "I simply ensured we were in compliance with all relevant regulations. If the Krelax chose not to do the same, that was their decision. You filed complaints against them. You buried them in legal requirements they could not understand. I may have flagged some irregularities with the appropriate oversight bodies," Gary admitted. Velkara studied him for a long moment. Then, to Gary's surprise, she laughed, a hissing, rasping sound that raised the hair on his neck. "Brilliant," she said. "You are a weapon, Gary Gunderson. A weapon that destroys enemies without ever firing a shot." "I'm just trying to do my job properly," Gary said, which was technically true, even if his actual job goal was to make himself so sufficiently annoying that they'd let him go. "Your job is about to expand," Velkara said. "The Rakthon cartel controls the manufacturing district. They have been a problem for years. I want you to handle them." Gary's stomach sank. "Handle them how? However you see fit." Velkara moved toward the window. "Use your paperwork, your regulations, your meetings. I do not care. Just remove them from my path." Before Gary could protest, she was gone, slithering out into the night with impossible speed. Gary poured himself a drink and stared at his reflection in the dark window. He'd been trying to make himself useless to the syndicate, but instead he'd become their most valuable asset. The irony wasn't lost on him. The next morning, Gary began researching the Rakthon cartel. They were old, established, and brutal. Their leader, Warmaster Rakthon himself, had held power for 30 years through a combination of military strength and ruthless cunning. His organization manufactured weapons, combat drugs, and restricted technology, all technically illegal, but generally overlooked by authorities who preferred not to start wars with heavily armed criminal enterprises. Gary opened a new file on his tablet and began typing. 3 days later, he walked into Rakthon cartel headquarters with nothing but his tablet and a briefcase full of documents. The guards nearly shot him on sight. Only the intervention of a mid-level lieutenant named Vorkath, who was curious about the suicidal human, kept Gary alive long enough to explain himself. "I'm here from the Galactic Manufacturing Standards Board," Gary said, showing Vorkath an identification badge he'd created using the Port Authority's template system and some creative digital manipulation. "We've received complaints about safety violations at this facility." Vorkath's 3 eyes blinked in sequence. "What board?" "The Galactic Manufacturing Standards Board," Gary repeated patiently. "We oversee compliance with industrial safety regulations across all registered manufacturing facilities." "You are registered, aren't you?" "This is a weapons manufacturing facility," Vorkath said slowly. "Illegal weapons." Gary made a note on his tablet. "Illegal for sale, yes, but the manufacturing process itself still needs to comply with workplace safety standards. Explosions, toxic chemical exposure, inadequate ventilation. These are serious concerns regardless of what you're producing. Do you have your safety inspection certificates?" "No one inspects us," Vorkath said. "We kill inspectors." "That's definitely a violation," Gary said, typing rapidly. "Section 12, Subsection 4 of the Workplace Safety Act prohibits violence against regulatory officials. I'll need to file a report about that." He looked up to find Vorkath staring at him with something approaching awe. "You are either the bravest or the stupidest creature I have ever encountered," the lieutenant said. "I'm just doing my job," Gary replied. "Now, can I speak with your safety compliance officer, or shall I conduct the inspection myself?" 20 minutes later, Gary stood before War Master Rakthon himself, a towering Dravakian whose cybernetic enhancements made him more machine than organic. The War Master's throne room was actually a converted factory floor, and the sounds of weapons manufacturing echoed around them. Rakthon's mechanical voice boomed through speakers embedded in his chest. "You dare enter my territory making demands?" Gary consulted his tablet. "I'm not making demands, War Master. I'm conducting a mandatory safety inspection. According to Regulation 2341B, all facilities engaged in industrial manufacturing must undergo inspection every 18 months. Your last inspection was," he scrolled through fabricated records, "never actually. That's a significant oversight." "I will crush you," Rakthon said simply. "That's also a violation," Gary said, making another note. "Workplace violence is strictly prohibited. I'm going to need you to attend a harassment prevention training seminar. I have a list of approved providers." Rakthon rose from his throne, his massive mechanical form towering over Gary. The various lieutenants and enforcers in the room tensed, waiting for their master to turn the impudent human into paste. Instead, Rakthon laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "You are the Velkara human," he said, "the one who destroyed the Krelax." "I'm Gary Gunderson, Operations Director for Velkara Syndicate Enterprises," Gary confirmed. "But the Krelax destroyed themselves through non-compliance. And now Velkara sends you to destroy me with your papers and your rules." Rakthon's optical sensors focused on Gary. "It will not work. I have armies, I have weapons. Your regulations mean nothing." Gary opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "These are cease and desist orders from the Galactic Patent Office. It seems many of your weapons' designs are protected intellectual property that you're manufacturing without licenses. I've filed complaints on behalf of 17 different defense contractors." Rakthon's mechanical hand crushed the arm of his throne. "Patent violations. You think I care about patents? The defense contractors do," Gary said. "Especially Dravakian military industries, which I believe holds the patents on roughly 30% of your cybernetic components." He looked pointedly at Rakthon's enhanced body. "They're very protective of their intellectual property. I sent them a detailed report about your operations yesterday." "They would never move against me," Rakthon growled. "The legal process would take years." "Normally, yes," Gary agreed. "But I also filed emergency injunctions claiming your patent violations represent a threat to galactic security. The fast-track process means you'll be served within 72 hours. He checked his watch. "Make that 68 hours now." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of machinery. "You are bluffing," Rakthon said, but his voice carried less certainty. Gary pulled out his tablet and showed Rakthon the filed documents, complete with official stamps and case numbers. "I never bluff, War Master. I simply follow the established procedures." Rakthon stared at the screen, his processors working through the implications. If the defense contractors moved against him, he'd face legal action that could freeze his assets, shut down his manufacturing, and potentially expose him to criminal prosecution that even his military strength couldn't prevent. The contractors had their own private armies and close ties to galactic authorities. "What does Velkara want?" Rakthon asked finally. "I'm not authorized to negotiate territorial agreements," Gary said. "But I could facilitate a discussion between your organizations about potential consolidation opportunities, perhaps a merger. I could draw up the paperwork." "A merger," Rakthon repeated flatly, "or a strategic partnership, joint venture, lots of options, really." Gary pulled up a presentation on his tablet. "I took the liberty of preparing some preliminary analysis of the synergies between your manufacturing capabilities and Velkara's distribution network. The potential efficiency gains are quite impressive. For the next 2 hours, Gary walked War Master Rakthon through a merger proposal that would essentially put Velkara in control of the combined operation, while making it look like a partnership between equals. He used terms like stakeholder engagement and value proposition and core competencies, until even the enhanced processors in Rakthon's mechanical brain began to overheat. "I need to think about this," Rakthon finally said. "Of course," Gary said, "but I should mention that the patent injunctions will proceed regardless. If you'd like me to file a motion to delay them while you consider the merger proposal, I'll need a signed letter of intent by tomorrow morning. Just to show good faith to the contractors." Rakthon's optical sensors dimmed, the equivalent of a glare. "You corner me with legal weapons." I provide you with options, Gary corrected. Option 1. Face legal action from multiple defense contractors, possible asset seizure, and extended litigation. Option 2. Enter into a mutually beneficial partnership with Velcara's organization that addresses the patent issues through proper licensing agreements. Entirely your choice. It wasn't really a choice, and they both knew it. 24 hours later, Gary had his signed letter of intent. 3 weeks after that, the merger was complete, and Rakthon found himself in the awkward position of being Velcara's co-equal partner. In an organization she completely controlled through a maze of holding companies and contractual obligations that Gary had carefully constructed. The Rakthon cartel had fallen without a single shot being fired. Velcara was delighted. She promoted Gary to Chief Strategic Officer and doubled his salary, which would have been great except that he still couldn't quit without being killed. Gary's reputation spread through New Houston's criminal underworld. The human who fought with paperwork. The manager who dismantled empires with meeting invitations and compliance requirements. Crime lords started avoiding him, treating him like some kind of cursed object that would destroy their organizations if touched, which gave Gary an idea. He spent a month secretly documenting everything. Every illegal transaction, every violation, every murdered rival and corrupted official. He compiled it into a massive database, cross-referenced and annotated, a prosecutor's dream. Then he added his own involvement, holding nothing back, and encrypted it all with a dead man's switch. If anything happened to him, the files would automatically transmit to every law enforcement agency in the sector. Then he called a meeting with Velcara. She arrived at the conference room he'd reserved in a legitimate office building, confused by the location but curious. Brakther accompanied her, as always, his hand never far from his weapons. Gary stood at the head of the table, his tablet connected to the room's display screen. Thank you for coming. I have a proposal to discuss regarding organizational restructuring. More restructuring? Velcara settled into a chair designed for humanoids, her serpentine body coiling awkwardly. The last restructuring made us the most powerful syndicate in 3 sectors. I'm aware, Gary said, which is why it's time to discuss an exit strategy. Brakther's crest flared. You wish to leave. I wish for all of us to leave, Gary said. He pulled up his presentation. I've been analyzing the long-term sustainability of our current operations, and I've concluded that we're approaching a critical inflection point. For the next hour, Gary laid out his case. He showed them the mathematical inevitability of their eventual downfall, how their very success was attracting more attention, how the number of potential enemies was growing, how even the smallest mistake would eventually cascade into catastrophic failure. He walked them through scenarios, projections, risk assessments. You're saying we should disband? Velcara asked, her tone dangerous. I'm saying we should transition to a legitimate business model, Gary said. He pulled up a new slide. I've identified several legal industries where our existing assets and expertise would translate effectively. Security consulting, import-export with proper licensing, manufacturing with appropriate permits. We could maintain our revenue stream while dramatically reducing our risk profile. We are criminals, Brakther growled. This is what we are. You're criminals because the current system makes criminality profitable, Gary countered. But I've identified multiple legal loopholes and regulatory gaps that we could exploit just as effectively. Consider it white-collar crime, same profit, significantly less violence. Velcara's eyes narrowed. And if we refuse, Gary took a breath, this was it. Then I respectfully submit my resignation, effective immediately. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Brakther's hand moved to his weapon. Gary continued, keeping his voice steady. I've documented everything. Every transaction, every operation, every detail of our organizational structure. If anything happens to me, that information goes to every law enforcement agency in the sector. You dare threaten us? Velcara's scales darkened to deep purple. I'm not threatening you, Gary said. I'm explaining the situation clearly so you can make an informed decision. Option 1. Continue as a criminal enterprise but without me and face the consequences of the information I've compiled. Option 2, transition to legitimate operations with my assistance, and I ensure the documentation is permanently destroyed. Brakther drew his weapon. Or we kill you now and find your files. The encryption is military grade, and the dead man's switch is distributed across multiple systems, Gary said. You'd need to find and disable all of them within 12 hours of my death. I'm good with systems administration. You won't make it. Velkara held up a hand, stopping Brakther. She studied Gary with renewed interest. You have been planning this since the beginning. I've been planning my exit since you forced me into this job, Gary admitted. But along the way, I realized something. You're not actually very good at being criminals. You're violent, yes, but you're terrible at the business side. That's why you needed me. And if you're going to need someone to manage your operations anyway, those operations might as well be legal. Legal operations are less profitable, Velkara said. Legal operations have lower margins but also lower overhead, Gary corrected. No need to pay for enforcers when you have courts. No need to hide from authorities when you're compliant. No risk of being killed by rivals when you can sue them instead. He pulled up a financial projection. I estimate we could maintain 80% of current revenue while reducing operational costs by 60%. The net result is actually higher profitability. Velkara studied the numbers. Despite herself, she was intrigued. Gary's projections and analyses had never been wrong before. Show me, she said finally. Show me how this would work. Gary spent the next 3 hours walking them through his plan. He'd created shell companies within shell companies, layers of legitimate business structures that could absorb their criminal assets and transform them into legal ones. The protection rackets became security consulting. The smuggling became import-export with creative but legal tariff interpretations. The money laundering infrastructure became a licensed financial services company. It was brilliant, and it was completely legal. The transition would take 6 months, Gary concluded. I've already filed the preliminary paperwork for most of the corporate entities. We'd need to wind down active criminal operations gradually to avoid suspicion. Brakther shook his head. This is cowardice. This is survival, Velkara corrected. She looked at Gary with something that might have been respect. You have truly thought of everything. That's what you hired me to do, Gary said. I'm just applying the same principles I've been using all along. Work within the system, find the loopholes, and exploit them legally. Velkara was silent for a long moment. Finally, she said, Very well, we will try your way. But if this fails, human, if your legal enterprises do not prove as profitable as you claim, the agreement is void. Fair enough, Gary said. He pulled out a contract he'd prepared. I took the liberty of drafting the terms of our new arrangement. You'll find it includes a performance-based compensation structure and clearly defined exit clauses for all parties. Brakther made a sound like grinding rocks. Even now you negotiate with paperwork. It's what I'm good at, Gary said. The transition took 8 months instead of 6, because Gary had underestimated how difficult it would be to convince various lieutenants and enforcers to accept legitimate employment. Many left the organization, unwilling to give up the criminal lifestyle. Others stayed, discovering they were just as good at intimidating people within legal boundaries as they had been outside them. The Zorgath clan, impressed by Gary's methodology, hired him as a consultant for their own transition. Soon other syndicates followed. Within a year, Gary had inadvertently transformed New Houston's criminal underworld into a network of aggressive but technically legal businesses. The authorities didn't know whether to arrest him or give him a medal. Gary didn't care either way. He'd finally managed to quit the Velkara organization, buying out his contract through a carefully negotiated settlement. He now ran his own consulting firm, helping criminal enterprises transition to legitimate operations for obscene amounts of money. It turned out that his years in retail management had prepared him perfectly for dealing with the galaxy's worst criminals. They were, after all, just difficult customers who happened to have weapons. Gary stood in his new office, a corner suite in New Houston's business district, and looked out over the city. Somewhere down there, Velkara was running a legitimate security corporation that was more profitable than her criminal empire had ever been. Rakthon's manufacturing company held 17 legal patents and had contracts with 3 galactic governments. The Zorgath clan operated a shipping company that actually paid its taxes. Gary's tablet chimed, another inquiry from a crime lord looking to go legitimate. He smiled and began drafting a response. He'd survived Black Friday at Super Mega Mart, and he'd survived the Velkara Syndicate. In the end, it turned out the skills were transferable. Whether you were dealing with angry customers or murderous aliens, the principle was the same. Stay calm, follow the procedures, and never let them see you sweat. And always have your paperwork in order. Gary opened his calendar and began scheduling next week's meetings. Somewhere in the galaxy, another criminal empire needed restructuring. Another warlord needed to understand the power of proper documentation. And another organization needed to learn that the deadliest weapon in the universe wasn't a plasma cannon or a fusion bomb. It was a well-written compliance manual and the patience to enforce it.